Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 124. Today's episode is called Long-Term Thinking. Today I'm going to talk about the long-term process when it comes to creating something, creating a side project, writing, learning a new skill as well. This is important when it comes to learning a foreign language like French or Italian or whatever foreign language you want to learn, or when it comes to even programming as well. That's another skill set that it takes a while to get good at and master. There are principles that we cover on these episodes on this podcast. There are principles to make the learning curve a bit easier to navigate and to manage, but at the end of the day, it's still a long-term process of mastery that you're going on, and it takes long-term thinking to help you to persist with that. What I found is that there's a big difference between knowing you should think long-term and actually implementing it. A lot of things get in the way. A lot of messages from the culture, from other people, it will make this more difficult to think long term. I guess a word for it would be resistance. Stephen Pressfield talks a lot about resistance in his book The Art of War, and resistance manifests everywhere. Anytime that you're being distracted from doing the work that you know you should be doing, or being how you know that you can be in the world, you're facing a level of resistance there, and it has many different disguises. And in the culture today, there's a lot of short-term thinking. There's a lot of shortcuts to success that aren't real shortcuts in the long term. Even with the self-help industry in general, the more you move forward, and it was from reading an article today about Tim Ferriss, him realizing that it's really pivotal to have self-acceptance at the root of what you're doing with self-improvement. If you haven't got that piece, then it just masks the insecurities that you have in yourself as a person, the things you're ashamed about. Really, you're just covering over that with a level of things that looks artificially maybe like a better version of you. But if there's no self-acceptance at the root, then it's just a tower that's going to collapse. So long-term thinking would tie into the self-acceptance. The more you have self-acceptance, the longer you're just going to stick at something. Long-term thinking also combines with a deeper sense of why you're doing something. So when you start off doing something, a creative side project, you mightn't necessarily have the language to articulate why this is important to you, what message you're trying to get across. What I've found over the last 3 years of this podcast is that it evolves over time. My primary goal has always been for myself, has been self-actualization with this process, to uncover aspects of myself that were in the shadows of my life, to talk to guests that give me a different perspective on things so that I can look at my life in a different way, as well to share that with a wider audience, because I know the stuff that I learned before I did the podcast really benefited me, and it wasn't mainstream information that I was learning. A lot of what got me into difficulty in my life has been listening to mainstream and listening to groupthink that wasn't catered to me on an individual level, and that's a lot of what ties into my purpose for creating this podcast. I'm very much focused on the individual and making the individual stronger so that they can make the collective stronger as well in their own way. So when I talk about the individual, it's not, you probably get this from these episodes anyway, but it's not from a sense of trying to be better than people. It's really from a sense of being you. And then I know that will help the collective as well. Like when you really show up as yourself and you get clear as well on your strengths, get clear on what your long-term vision for your life is, it helps other people to start doing that as well. And that's how the collective will get better as well. It's not a negative competitive state to be in. It's more about self-actualization. So with the long-term thinking, your why is important. Practical example here of with podcasts. I think the average podcast lasts about 174 days. I was reading that recently. And I think a lot of the reasons behind that stems from the why people created a podcast in the first place. I think even in the article I mentioned a few reasons. One of the reasons was, well, everybody's doing it, so why not do that? That's a great manifestation of groupthink. That's not going to sustain you in the long term, because podcasting is not easy. Another reason could be money. You might think the podcast is a great vehicle for creating money, or it might do for some businesses and stuff. I don't know what. Yeah, it really depends on why you set it up. But if you're, as an individual person, you haven't already got a business and you think that you're going to earn money from podcasting, it might happen, but there's a higher chance that it won't happen. So it really stems from the reasons why there. You'll see that play out in a few different fields. Entrepreneurship as well is a notorious field for a high failure rate. I think it's good 80%, 90% of businesses that fail, they don't make it. They don't make it at all. And it can be very intimidating to look at that on a purely statistical level. But if you dig deeper and dig into the reasons why somebody started something in the first place, and were they thinking in long term or short term, because society does set us up to think in a short term way about things. The long term thinking process as well, it's actually hard to implement and execute, because it's not only about the thinking, it's also about the emotions that come up in the process. Because of the nature, it's long term. You're putting a lot of time, energy into something. It's delayed gratification. So you're putting a lot of time, energy, and effort up front for rewards that you will get further down the line, and you might never even get. There's no guarantee you will get these rewards as well. You might have specific rewards in mind that you might never reach. You might get something actually better, or something that you might consider worse. But it's a hard thing to implement without a deeper sense of why. So the emotional side of things, it's really important to keep in mind when it comes to long-term thinking. It's not just a logical thought process when you go about implementing something. There's a lot of emotion in there, and that's why when I look at studies and when I look at academia, I take the conclusions with a pinch of salt. I don't disregard them. There's importance in them, but they're not complete. Anything isn't complete until it stands up in a robust way to reality, humans, with emotion and all that. Because that's going to be the toughest part of the process for you if you're going to stick at something for 5 years. It's the resistance, it's the emotion. It's like starting off, there's a good chance you're going to be around people who aren't motivated. So you mightn't be starting off in the best of environments. You mightn't be around people who got their own projects, who are encouraging you to follow your own projects, who see the benefit in what you're doing, see the value. You might be in the exact opposite types of environments where people just aren't motivated to talk about this stuff, aren't motivated to have meaningful conversations. You might be in the exact opposite environment. So you're going to have to meet that. You're going to have to create what you're creating in the midst of that. Over time, it will get a bit better as you start to really understand how much of an impact you have on your environment, how much power you have of putting yourself into certain situations, taking yourself out of certain situations, showing up as yourself, being a bit more vulnerable, listening to people more. Because what I've learned over the years too is that a lot of the times I had assumptions about people. I wasn't properly listening to them. I wasn't giving them a chance. Like, I've just learned that over time. So starting off is not necessarily even the environment. That will definitely play a part, but you'll figure that out, how much of it's the environment, how much of it's actually your own perception of the environment. So that will be something that will be a struggle, especially at the start, because you're at a position where even a year into it, 2 years into it, even still today, 3 years into this, you could be in a position where, well, I don't feel it as much now in the third year. With the first 2 years, definitely, you're in a position where you don't have much confidence in what you're doing. You don't fully know what you're doing. You don't have much skills in what you're doing. And then you're also around people who mightn't be doing their own thing, who aren't. And when they're not doing their own thing, this is the thing, they're not facing these emotions that you're facing right now of being vulnerable, of being yourself, of voicing your thoughts, not having things perfect. And then you could get ridiculed by these people, laughed at, because it's easy for somebody to throw stones when they're not doing anything themselves. So you're going to have to face that, and no amount of thinking is going to get you around that. It's actually feeling into that, going through the experience. What has actually helped me, though, is meditation and looking more at spirituality, Eckhart Tolle, people who are pointing to the present moment, so that when I did have to go through, and if I do still have to go through, emotions where I feel a bit ridiculed, I feel a bit laughed at, a bit antagonized like that, that I have an awareness that this is an emotion that's going through my body right now. It's not going to last forever. When I didn't really understand this type of stuff, when I didn't have, not saying that I fully understand it now, but there's an awareness there. When I was younger, when I didn't have that type of insight, that was very difficult to deal with, because those emotions feel like they're going to last forever, but they don't. They never do. Just that perspective alone can keep you going for the long term. And you need those types of perspectives to keep you with long-term thinking in an environment that might be set up exactly the opposite way to succeeding in the world. So it's great having a vision for your life in 5 years' time, but how do you go about actually executing that? Because 5 years is a long time. And I like the Bill Gates quote that most people underestimate what they can do in a year and they overestimate. Oh, I butchered that. Most people overestimate what they can do in a year and they underestimate what they can do in 3 years. I would be of the belief that is true, having gone through this 3-year cycle with the podcast. The nuance that I've seen here, though, is that the external metrics didn't increase that dramatically in the 3 years. What did increase was my confidence and my clarity and my sense of purpose, meaning direction, self-actualization. That was the primary goal. I have noticed quite a big increase for myself over the last 3 years in that. But I've been intentional with that. I've been conscious about that with the guests I've on, with the courses I've been doing, with the stuff I've been reading, with the stuff as well. Like I do a little bit of, I haven't been doing it recently, but sometimes I'll do a little bit of cognitive behavior therapy, really questioning the thoughts that are going through my head. Sometimes I do a bit of journaling, I'll do a bit of reading. Like I'm always just a bit of experimenting. There's certain core things that I do. I read an article actually in the last week or so from, what's his name? I like the guy. Stoicism guy, Ryan Holiday. Yeah, Ryan Holiday. I read one of his articles on Medium there a few weeks back. It made a lot of sense to me. He talked about practices rather than, I think, rituals. Again, it comes back to the self-help industry. There's a lot of misperceptions, a lot of misinformation within the self-help industry for the amount of positivity it does bring, for the amount of possibility and opportunity it does bring. There's a lot of shadow sides to the self-help industry that are destructive in nature. And one of the things, I think he talked about the article in relation to the context of COVID, whereas if you're somebody who's got rituals, very rigid rituals of your morning rituals and all that jazz, I've never fully got into that. But if it's very rigid and it's not robust enough to hold up to situations in your life where, for example, you have a pandemic we're dealing with now, even normal situations like the flow of life where family, have kids to deal with, different life situations that will happen, that will change, that will alter your day. So rigid rituals don't hold up to that, but practices do. And the type of practices he was talking about were things that I've been doing anyway, and it was just good language the way he kind of phrased it. So Ryan's a writer. He's got an interesting story. I'd encourage you to look into him. He was like a marketing director at American Apparel. Is that the right pronunciation? Apparel. American Apparel. Probably wrong. But he wrote a book called Trust Me, I'm Lying. So he divulges a lot of the secrets to marketing, and it really opens your eyes as well to see how little due diligence is done on reporting sometimes, even from places like the Huffington Post. And I don't even read, to be honest, a lot of from the Huffington Post or anything like that. But yeah, it just kind of, it's an eye opener that there's a lot of things, there's just a lot of, it's just incentives and stuff like that. It comes back to incentives and anything. Read the book. I'm butchering it there. But anyway, he's talking about the practices, and practices for him was like going for a walk, reading. So like what my practices have been over the years, there was stuff that's been productive for me anyway. I've got other habits and practices that are counterproductive sometimes, but I'm constantly working through this stuff with a level of compassion too, because if you haven't got the compassion piece, you're not going to work through stuff. But that's a little tangent there now. But practices like I go for a walk most days, I'll go for a run, get out in nature. Sometimes I even go for a bat. I go for things that are like relaxing. It allows my mind to just relax, unwind. Even if you read about generals over the years, I think Napoleon was somebody that go for a bat sometimes, and it would just be a way of letting the mind wander, relax. Find activities, find practices in your day where you can do that, because even on the science level, it ties into that diffuse mode of thinking, the focus mode of thinking, where you're focused on a problem, trying to figure it out. Then the diffuse mode of thinking, where you're just engaging in activities, or maybe not even any activity, practices where you're just letting your mind wander. That's good for creativity, connecting the dots in different ways and expressing things in a different way that might have never been expressed before. Exactly like that. And that just made a lot more sense because that holds up the robustness, because with practices, there's no definite time. Like even when I go for a walk or a run, I don't go for a run at exactly the same time every day. I don't even write at the same time every day. I don't know whether that's a deficiency in myself, that I haven't figured that out myself, because I've heard a lot of writers over the years, successful ones as well, that will say that there's a certain time for them that works for writing. I haven't found that really. Sometimes I find in the morning my mind is a bit more chilled out, works a bit better. I think maybe the morning. I haven't done it after 12 o'clock midnight. I've heard that quite a bit mentioned. I haven't got into that because that's just a bit too late for me to be writing, to be honest. I might try it out down the line, an experiment. But if I was to say a certain time, it would probably be in the morning, and that's what I am doing right now. I'll write at 7 o'clock in the morning before I begin work. I'll write a little bit. And they're the types of practices anyway. Practices are better than rituals, I've found over the years. I've experimented a bit with rituals, and practices have made more sense. So I've covered a good bit about the why. So having a strong why to start is going to help you with long-term thinking. Talked a little bit about the emotions, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the paradox of long-term thinking. So the paradox here is that in order to focus on the long term, you think really short term, like day-to-day, present moment stuff. So this ties into habit formation, and it ties into building a self-image. So the thing is, you need to create a self-image that will turn you into the person capable of achieving what you see yourself achieving in that future vision. This is another area where the self-help industry often gets it backwards. So they'll often encourage you to build a self-image before you do the thing. What I figured out in reality is that it's actually the opposite way around. You build a self-image through action. What you need to do is get clear on where you want to go, what are the practical skills that will get you there, and then by consistently doing that over time, over the 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, long-term cycle, that's how your self-image shifts and changes. So for example, with this podcast 3 years ago, I couldn't do a podcast like this. I'd just be afraid of it. I'd have a visceral reaction. So I'd be short of breath. My body would be very rigid. I'd be very uptight. I'd be very conscious about how I'm being perceived. That has lessened over time as I built the practice in actual speaking, and my self-image has shifted too, that I can see I'm the type of person who can do this now because I've got evidence. Because that's how your mind works as well. This is how it's very difficult to convince your mind of something that isn't true. Your mind will look back in the past and see things that are evidence to prove that what you're trying to believe is true or not. And if your mind is looking back and there's no evidence that what you're trying to believe is true, it won't believe it, even though you might try and convince yourself that it's true. Your body won't believe it. Your body won't lie. So when I was starting off trying to build a self-image of a certain type of person, I don't think I did it for the podcast. I'll take this as an example. If I started off in the first episode trying to convince myself that I'm an experienced podcaster, I'm the Joe Rogan of podcasts from day one, it would never work. I'd just be fooling myself, because when I hit record on it, the nervousness, that energy, that anxiety would start appearing, would start manifesting, because I just had no experience in doing it. Didn't know what to expect. It's a normal, natural thing. But that's how you change your self-image over time, is through action. So you've got the long-term vision, 3-5 years. Doesn't need to be crystal clear. You just need to have a general sense of it, and then translate that into practical skills. So my general thing has always been self-education. The practical skills that have emerged from that have been the podcasting, my coding skills, and my writing. That has evolved over time. That wasn't something I could figure out at the start, because if I tried to figure it out at the very start, I would have said, okay, I'm going to have to create courses for people to consume, a YouTube channel. So I did all this stuff. It didn't, and I've done a Udemy course. If you want to check it out, it's on my website, happymindset.com. So I've done a few of these things, and I'm not saying I'm ruling them out entirely, but I've just found that the podcasting and the writing and the coding right now, they work for me. So I just keep doing that. When I get enough momentum and leverage, I might diversify and go into other things that are in the self-education space. But right now, that's what's happening with the practical skills that have been translated here. So then, how to make this manageable? Because 5 years is a long time, a lot of boredom, a lot of a lot of routine, a lot of habits go into it. How you build a habit, how you build a self-image is through habits, regular, consistent, daily habits. Break the habit down into very, very small, manageable piece. So for me, writing emerged because I also started the reading habit. So if I didn't start the reading habit, I had a very little material to actually write with. I wouldn't have much substance in my writing. I wouldn't have much stuff that gives you food for thought. Because I read a lot and I combine ideas in different ways, I add in my own perspective, my own life experience, my own thoughts. I add in all these kind of variables that are uniquely from me, combined with the reading that I do. That's what makes writing work then. So in order to get to writing as a skill, you start the reading habit, the writing habit. That's 5 minutes a day. If you've never written or read regularly before, start 5 minutes a day, even a page a day. Just find your baseline and you increment from there. Because 5 years, 3 years even, is a long time. But when you do these things consistently, they'll build. You'll start finding after a year, whatever, I don't know what your time frame, everybody's time frame is different, but you'll start finding that you'll be reading more, because if it's something that you enjoy doing, you'll want to do more of it. Where you can get stuck here, I'll just highlight this because just to show what this is actually showing you, rather than misinterpreting this. If you find that you're still struggling with reading, you've broken it down into the smallest habit, you're still struggling, you're not seeing any increases, then you've probably chosen the wrong thing. Just reflect on who gave you the idea to read. Was it something that was actually authentic to you? It probably isn't. So use that as a sign of when you're taking on board somebody else's perspective without translating it into your own experience, how you feel about things. Because you might be a kinesthetic learner, you might prefer audiobooks. You really have to individualize it to yourself, but the principle is the same. So that's the paradox of long-term thinking. That can help you to break it down into a long-term manageable process. Another person to think of as well in podcasting is Joe Rogan. He's made a big deal with Spotify there in September. And if you look at him, I don't know an awful lot about Joe Rogan. I know a little bit about him. I like his podcast. When you think about Joe Rogan, you think about a typical kind of alpha male. But if you actually listen to the guy, he's very smart, I find. He's smart as in, he knows what he knows, and he knows that he doesn't know a lot of stuff. There's a humility there, and he's good conversation. He knows what he's good at, and that's what I like about him. And as well, the fact he spent a good 11 years doing that podcast before he had that Spotify deal. He was doing podcasts when it was uncool to do podcasts. That's one of the reasons people do podcasts today is it seems like the cool, popular thing to do. And there's no longevity in that if you're basing something off of a why like that. Because podcasting, the reality is that it's difficult. Like anything you want to get good at, anything that will have meaning for you, it's difficult. And if you don't have the right why to begin with, it's going to be difficult to sustain that for 11 years. That's a long time for somebody to be doing something. So that's it. That's what I just wanted to add a little bit about Joe Rogan there as well. I suppose it's another thing about judging a book by its cover. I think there's a lot of depth there. I'm not saying. Again, it's another one of those things. It's just complex. I just don't like these conversations where it's trying to simplify and pigeonhole somebody. I think there's a lot of complexity to that podcast, good and bad, and everything. Like in anybody's podcast, like my podcast as well. So I just wanted to add that in at the end there, and that's it. That's the long-term thinking that will help you to create things for the long term with your creative side projects, and will give them time to flourish as well. So that's it. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.